About 3 weeks ago, I drove my son out to a national park for a little weekend camping trip. We took the 410 out from Tacoma into Mount Rainier, a place my own dad used to take me when I was a kid. I wanted my son, David, who's 2.5, to find the same joy of the wilderness that I had. But I'm quite convinced that he will be terrified of forests for the rest of his life. When we arrived that Friday, the weather was crisp and the first signs of spring had finally made themselves known. We walked, or rather, I walked with David on my shoulders for about 2, maybe 3 hours from the parking lot, into a small, desolate camping ground with a pre-made fire pit. I'm not a very overprotective parent, so I let David wobble around a bit while I set up the tent. Just as I was about done and getting ready to unload our 3-day supply into the tent, I heard David make some sounds from behind me. Now, I recognize these sounds immediately, as they are sounds he usually makes when he's excited about something. I turned around and saw him sitting in the grass, about 20 feet away, staring into the woods. Even more strangely, he was doing this thing he does when he's particularly excited about something, in which he slaps both of his legs repeatedly. I slowly walked over while trying to keep an eye on both him and the woods at the same time, but there was nothing in the tree line that I could make out. When I was finally by his side, I asked him what he had seen, and at this, his response was, "Monkey Man." He was smiling, still slapping his legs, and as much as I tried to match his excitement like a good parent should do, suddenly, the serenity of the woods was replaced by a sense of unease. I once again fixed my eyesight on the tree line and peered in very, very carefully. It was just such an incredibly strange thing for him to say. I picked David up, not wanting to leave him alone anymore, at least until I could regain some clarity, and walked into the tree line. I don't know how many of you are parents, but the last thing you want to do when you're taking your kid out for a fun weekend is to frighten them. I mention this because the sensible thing might have been to hush him, to tell him to keep quiet for a while. But then, I also knew that realistically, this was just an imaginative manifestation. After a few minutes of scouting around with David up on my shoulders, I decided to return to camp. It was about 3:30, I believe, so I made us some lunch, still keeping an occasional eye on the space at which David had been clapping and yapping just a few minutes before. As much as I tried to forget it, I just couldn't. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in aliens, ghosts, or even Bigfoots. But I suppose my parental instinct was simply in too much of a high gear for me to let it go. So as the cold sun was setting, I decided to ask David a bit more about what he had seen. As I was getting the fire going, I asked him about the monkey man. I asked him if it was a big monkey man. David thought about it for a second. He then laughed and nodded. I then asked him if he seemed like a nice monkey man, and David once again giggled in approval. I wasn't really sure what else to ask. Nightfall struck, and on full bellies, I read a chapter from a book to him as he fell asleep in his sleeping bag. When I fell asleep myself, I had almost forgotten about the monkey man. I awoke in pitch darkness. The fire pit was out. I reached out to feel for David and panic struck me hard. He wasn't in the tent anymore. With only my underwear on, I stormed out but realized it was too dark to see anything. So I dropped back into the tent and tore my flashlight out of my bag. I was screaming his name all the while. With only the weak beam of a flashlight I didn't think I would ever have to actually rely on, I shone it around in circles, still calling out for David. For some reason, I ran towards the spot at which David had been so transfixed in the daytime. I shouted his name into the trees. As I trotted inwards into the pitch-black woods, I was too frantic to notice how badly my feet were getting scraped up by the bark and stone. After only about a minute of walking, I saw something that made me drop the flashlight and bolt forward. David was standing there, peering into the darkness, utterly still. I grabbed onto him hard, beginning to sob. Still clutching him tightly, I picked up the flashlight again, which had been idly beaming the ground, and looked around for a moment, fending off the darkness. I could see nothing around us. As I carried him back, looking over my shoulder, I asked what had happened. He replied that he didn't know, and that he was tired. David has sleepwalked before, so I was just chalking it up to that. That night, I locked up the tent from the inside with a padlock. I only got about 3 hours of good rest. David himself slept like a rock, despite my trembling embrace. The following morning, I cooked us some breakfast. David had no recollection of what had happened, and seemed content to continue the trip. I thought it would be careless to shrug off last night's event as mere sleepwalking, especially considering the monkey man business. But I also thought it would be a bit too silly to cancel the entire trip over it. Thus, I made a promise to myself that if anything else were to happen, we would drive back to Tacoma at a moment's notice. The rest of the day was actually quite nice, and helped me take my mind off of things. David was at first a little upset at not having the iPad, but eventually discovered that nature can be just as cool as pixels. We made some bark boats with faces on them and sent them downstream, watched some squirrels, listened to the birds. It was everything I had hoped the trip would be. At dusk, when the trees stretched long shadows across the grass, David was getting too cold and too tired to play anymore, so I decided we would spend the rest of the day in the tent. I had brought along this game where you have to trace the outline of a person with an electrode, and if your aim is off, it makes a funny sound, kind of like Operation. I don't remember what it was called, but David found it hilarious. It's a simple game, but supposedly helps develop motor skills. During one of David's turns, he made an error and the little speaker made the sound again, and David bellowed into laughter. What happened next filled me with a sense of fear that I doubt anything will ever match it. From about 50 feet away, I heard the exact same laugh that David had made, only it was much deeper. It was almost like when you record yourself speaking, then digitally pitch it down. I froze, and this time I couldn't hide my fear from David. I could tell by his face he had heard it too. I lifted my finger up to my lips to communicate to him that we needed to be quiet. It was at this moment that I also noticed that the sun had completely set. I also realized just how quiet the woods were. Every second felt like an eternal minute as we sat there in the tent, absolutely still, enveloped in a thick silence. When the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears finally ceased, I leaned over slowly towards my backpack to retrieve my handgun out of it. I never go into the woods without it. When I turned around to face David, I noticed that he had picked up the game again. I sternly removed it from his hand and whispered with equal sternness, "Not now, David." Then, just as I had said it, a low, broken voice whispered from literally inches from the tent,
"Not now, David."
The next thing I was aware of is that I was shooting through the fabric in the tent, in the direction of the sound. David was screaming, and as the gunshot rang throughout the woods, I heard the last remnants of something sprinting away. With my hand trembling violently, I opened the padlock and jumped out with a flashlight in my left hand, aiming the faint beam into black nothingness. I grabbed David, stuffed everything within arm's reach into the backpack, and ran. The way back was pure terror. There was not a second at which I did not feel as if something was right behind us, ready to leap out from behind us, or the side of the trail, out from the darkness. The only thing I could say to David was, "It's okay, you'll get the iPad soon. Do you want the iPad?" Nothing ever did leap out at us. Nor did I hear anything except the rushing of the wind and the occasional running stream by the trailside. I was so out of it that even in the car, I kept checking the back seat to see if there was something sitting behind us, ready to kill us. I don't know how to explain to David's pediatrician what happened in Mount Rainier. I haven't even told his mother the full story, only that I thought someone came up to our tent and that I had to fire a warning shot. Needless to say, David hasn't been the same since. He has been getting constant headaches, which might be from the damage to his ears by the gunshot. I don't really know how to end this story, but one thing is for certain. Never, ever take your kids out to Mount Rainier National Park.